After Queen Elizabeth I died, her counselors searched her belongings and found a letter buried deep in them. When they looked closer, their blood ran cold. Stick around to find out exactly what they found. In 1533, Elizabeth was born into the biggest scandal of her time. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had seduced her way into King Henry VIII's bedroom and triggered his monumental divorce from Catherine of Aragon, the scandal that started the English Reformation, and that was really just the beginning. Not too many people can say that their own father executed their mother, but that's exactly what happened to poor Elizabeth. Anne Boleyn fell out of King Henry's favor, and he beheaded his queen on May 19, 1536, when Elizabeth was just over 2 years old. Elizabeth also had to deal with a new stepmom very soon after Anne Boleyn went to the gallows. Henry's third queen, Jane Seymour, moved into the palace just 11 days after the execution. Then, just a year after Seymour married King Henry VIII, Elizabeth had a new baby brother, Edward. But he wasn't just any baby brother, he was the male heir Henry VIII literally killed for. By the age of 12, Elizabeth had translated her stepmother Catherine Parr's English work Prayers or Meditation into no fewer than 3 different languages, Italian, Latin, and French, and gave it to her father as a present. In fact, by the time Elizabeth was done with her schooling, she was probably one of the best educated women of her time. While she was still a teenager, her father finally passed, leaving Elizabeth an orphan in the care of her stepmother, Catherine Parr. Parr almost immediately married Thomas Seymour, the new king's uncle. Almost as soon as Princess Elizabeth moved in with her foster parents, the 40-year-old Seymour started behaving in increasingly disturbing ways towards her. First, he would creep into her bedroom in his nightgown and tickle the princess. According to records from the time, Elizabeth's stepmother, Catherine Parr, did nothing to stop these inappropriate behaviors. In fact, she even participated in them. At least twice, she helped her husband tickle Elizabeth, and in a particularly alarming incident, she held the princess down as Seymour ripped the girl's dress into pieces. Catherine Parr made a chilling discovery. She stumbled across Seymour and the teenaged Elizabeth locked in an embrace, indicating that the inappropriate interactions were quickly becoming romantic. Whether from jealousy or for fear for the girl, Parr sent the princess away soon after. But that was not the last Elizabeth saw of Seymour. Mere months after sending Elizabeth away, Catherine Parr perished in childbirth. With his wife conveniently out of the way, the widowed Seymour turned his attention back to the teenage princess. The royal council had had enough of Seymour's creepy scheming, and they charged him with treason for his plot to marry Elizabeth. The princess's tormentor was finally executed on March 20th, 1549. Elizabeth was still barely in her teen years. On July 6, 1553, Elizabeth's brother Edward, Henry VIII's only male heir, died, throwing the kingdom into chaos. Shockingly, he named his cousin Jane Grey, not his sisters Elizabeth or Mary, as his successor. Suddenly, Mary and Elizabeth found themselves fighting for their birthright. Elizabeth and Mary proved too powerful for Jane Grey and her forces. She was defeated and became known as the 9 Days Queen. In August 1553, Mary rode into London to officially claim the throne. It could have been a triumphant moment of sisterly love, but that's not quite how it went down. Elizabeth and Mary were very different people, and not just because they had different mothers. Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon, raised her to be a strict Catholic. Meanwhile, Elizabeth, born not just at the height of the English Reformation, but practically because of it, was Protestant. Even as young girls, Mary and Elizabeth had never been friends. Mary refused to recognize that Anne Boleyn was queen, or even that Elizabeth was a princess. Mary might have had another big reason for being jealous of Elizabeth. Her husband, King Philip, reportedly planned to marry Elizabeth should anything happen to Mary, particularly if she perished in childbirth. You don't get the nickname Bloody Mary for nothing, and Mary's reign quickly became unpopular for her ruthless persecution of Protestants, as well as her infamously gruesome method of burning heretics at the stake. So when a rebellion broke out in 1554, Mary instantly suspected Elizabeth and threw her sister in the Tower of London. For 3 terrifying months, Elizabeth's life hung in the balance at the Tower. During this time, Mary's advisors whispered in her ear that while Elizabeth breathed, her throne would never be safe. The only thing to do, they said, was to execute her own sister. In the end, Elizabeth's supporters in Mary's court convinced the Queen to spare her sister's life. Mary exiled Elizabeth to the countryside and put her under house arrest. Then, in 1558, Queen Mary, who had been unhealthy for some time, passed without having had any children. Elizabeth was next in line for the throne. Princess Elizabeth became Queen Elizabeth I. From the moment she became queen, Elizabeth's advisors assumed she would take a husband, not only to strengthen England's power, but also to help produce an heir. Though she considered eligible candidates until she was 50, she never did tie the knot. Elizabeth might never have married, but her bedroom antics became infamous. One of her most notorious dalliances was with her handsome childhood friend, Robert Dudley. Unfortunately, there was one big problem when it came to Robert Dudley. He was already married. His wife, Amy Robsart, was battling breast cancer, and everyone assumed she wasn't long for this world. But the way she died was much more suspicious and violent than anyone could have predicted. Dudley's wife, Amy, passed in September 1560, but not from breast cancer. She died after falling down a flight of stairs. The coroner might have ruled it an accident, but many people in the palace assumed Dudley had done the deed to secure his queen's affections. Their road to the altar finally seemed clear, but was it? Historians agree that Elizabeth was fully prepared to marry Dudley, but as her childhood friend held no political clout, and as royals from all over Europe were currently vying for the Queen's hand, her counselors told her in no uncertain terms that if she married Dudley, they would revolt. Elizabeth reluctantly backed off the marriage, but that didn't mean she forgot about Dudley. The Queen was intensely jealous of Dudley's time and affections, so when she discovered his ultimate betrayal, she was enraged. In 1578, Dudley married Elizabeth's distant relative, Lettice Knowles. He tried to keep the nuptials a secret, which made it all the worse when Elizabeth found out. When the Queen got wind of her true love's wedding, she was so furious that she banished Lettice from her court. She never forgave the woman and never acknowledged the nuptials as long as she lived. Elizabeth's refusal to ever marry and her nickname the Virgin Queen skyrocketed her to cult status. Poets wrote about her in bombastic terms, comparing her to figures like goddesses and the Virgin Mary. Besides the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth's other nicknames were Gloriana and Good Queen Bess, but the real woman behind the nicknames was far from perfect. Although Elizabeth I was always careful to present her best self, which often meant wearing heavy makeup, her cosmetics had a dark side. The Queen's makeup was made of abrasive and even poisonous products like lead and vinegar, which did major damage to Elizabeth's skin and health. The Queen also had a notorious sweet tooth as well as a fear of dentists. As she grew older, her teeth started to yellow and decay, crumbling in on each other. It was so bad that foreign dignitaries often couldn't even understand Elizabeth when she spoke to them. Elizabeth's gross dental hygiene actually started a trend. Since sugar was considered a luxury, some women then blackened their teeth both to emulate their queen and show off their wealth. Some historians believe Elizabeth was what we'd call a polyglot, or someone with an innate skill for learning foreign tongues. She could speak 11 languages, including Latin, Greek, and even Aramaic, and spoke many as if they were her native language. One of Elizabeth's most bitter enemies was also one of her closest relatives, her Catholic cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. From the very beginning, Mary posed a threat to Elizabeth's reign and religion, spurring a game of thrones for the ages. For a while, Elizabeth and Mary went the frenemies route. Despite the fact that Elizabeth supported Scotland's rebels against Mary, She still bizarrely offered up her favorite Robert Dudley for Mary to wed, but neither Mary nor Dudley were smitten with each other, and Elizabeth's awkward ploy fizzled out. Eventually, Mary's forces grew so strong and her decisions became so erratic, Elizabeth had to take drastic action. She tore Mary away from her baby son, imprisoned her in Loch Leven Castle, and then forced her to abdicate. Astonishingly, Mary spent the next 19 years of her life under Elizabeth's guard, but Elizabeth's most chilling act was yet to come. One day, Queen Elizabeth discovered that Mary, Queen of Scots, was helping incite a rebellion against the English crown from her jail cell. Elizabeth responded with a brutal show of force. On February 8, 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, met the axe. After Mary's death, Elizabeth grew intensely remorseful and even claimed that she had signed her cousin's warrant without understanding her advisors would carry it out immediately. While it's possible Elizabeth's regret was very real, many historians are suspicious of her backtracking. After all, it's pretty hard to sign someone's death warrant half-heartedly. Elizabeth's reign is known as a golden age of exploration. One of her favorite explorers was Francis Drake, who circumnavigated the globe between 1577 and 1580, earning himself a knighthood from his queen. Queen Elizabeth is perhaps most famous for defeating the Spanish Armada, which put a little thing called British sea power on the map. After Elizabeth's envoy, Francis Drake, raided Spanish ships, King Philip of Spain, yes, Elizabeth's ex-brother-in-law, decided he had quite enough of England and took immediate action. Philip II sent his Spanish Armada to invade England in 1588, bent on destroying Elizabeth and her reign. To everyone's surprise, the great naval power of Spain succumbed to the attacks of English fireships. Philip's navy had to turn tail and return back to Spain in shambles. Elizabeth used the crisis of the conflict with Spain to turn herself into a warrior queen. When she inspected her troops on August 8, 1588, she donned a silver breastplate under a white dress. Her speech has gone down in history. "I know I have the body but of a weak and feeble woman," she said, "but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too." People now see the Spanish Armada as a turning point in Elizabeth's reign, and it was. But it was a very different victory than what people imagine. The triumph was more of a propaganda campaign for Elizabeth than anything else, as the English success hinged on Spanish mistakes rather than British power. In fact, the very next year, England sent a 150-ship fleet to Spain, where they were defeated. Up to 15,000 men lost their lives, and Spain actually held on to its naval dominance at the time. Though many historians note that Elizabeth stayed single in order to hold on to power and play her suitors off of one another, she did get serious with men other than Robert Dudley. When she was courting Francis, Duke of Anjou, she often wore a frog-shaped earring the Duke had given her as a token of his affection. Elizabeth's reign was truly a golden age for many. In addition to Francis Drake's feats at sea, literature blossomed during this time with heavy hitters like William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe writing masterworks. But let's not give too much credit to good Queen Bess here. She wasn't really much of a patron of the arts. Another of the great English poets of the time, Edmund Spenser, paid homage to Elizabeth in his epic poem, The Faerie Queene. Elizabeth I is the character of Belphoebe, a strong virgin huntress who fights off her would-be attackers. Elizabeth must have liked the portrayal, as Spenser was one of the only writers she ever patronized. Elizabeth lived in poverty after her mother's execution. Her father, Henry VIII, ignored and neglected her so completely that Elizabeth's guardians had to beg the king for finances to provide Elizabeth with clothes that fit her. Later, when she became queen, Elizabeth collected more than 2,000 dresses, and even that wasn't enough. She allegedly took a dress from one of her maids out of envy when she saw how good it looked on her. It's no wonder then that Elizabeth I loved clothes. Not only did she start many fashion trends, but her clothes were routinely tweaked and updated, and carefully chosen based on what look she needed to convey, mostly trying to invoke ideas of purity and divinity. But she was also generous with her things and passed hand-me-downs to her ladies-in-waiting. Although generous with her servants, Elizabeth I expected total loyalty and was quick to fly into a rage, just like her father. During one outburst after her maid had angered her, she broke the maid's finger with a hairbrush. Even worse, the guilty queen told everyone it was an accident involving a fallen candlestick. Sometimes Elizabeth trusted her ladies-in-waiting as royal jailers. One of her favorite attendants was Bess of Hardwicke, who was likely the most powerful lady-in-waiting in the Queen's court. In 1569, Elizabeth even asked Hardwicke and her husband to hold Mary Queen of Scots on her behalf. The couple performed this thankless duty for 15 years. As she grew older, Elizabeth's courtiers never let on that her beauty was fading and continued to compliment her, as if she was still the 25-year-old queen she had been at her coronation. Sadly, it seems as though Elizabeth started to believe them and played favorites with whomever could compliment her the most. This had very dire consequences. One of Elizabeth's favorites later in life was Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, who took advantage of his good looks to quickly rise at court, gaining great power with very little responsibility. In 1599, he deserted his high military post for the umpteenth time, and Elizabeth finally reprimanded him, putting him under house arrest and taking away his luxuries. In 1601, Essex plotted to kidnap the Queen and take power for himself. Unfortunately for him, he didn't count on the fact that, well, nobody liked him and he had close to 0 supporters. Elizabeth caught wind of the meager plot and, finally coming to terms with her lack of judgment, had him beheaded. The Queen never got over Devereux's death. In 1602, a good year after her favorite's plot against her, one courtier remarked that her delight is to sit in the dark and sometimes with shedding tears to bewail Essex. Just a few years before her death, Elizabeth claimed that though single, she was actually married to her kingdom. In a speech, she referred to all my husbands, my good people. Elizabeth's last years were full of heartache and tragedy. In the fall of 1602, just months before her end, many of her friends and loved ones passed on, leaving the Queen depressed and despondent. According to those close to her, she spent her last days lying motionless on cushions in an unremovable melancholy. Just before she passed, Elizabeth finally chose a successor, at least unofficially. James VI, the son of her fallen cousin Mary Queen of Scots. Her advisors secretly prepped James to be the heir, getting him to butter up Elizabeth with a couple of complimentary letters. Though she never publicly declared James as her successor, Elizabeth apparently made her intentions known to her advisors. On March 24, 1603, Queen Elizabeth I passed during the early hours of the morning at Richmond Palace. She was 69 years old, and her reign remains one of the most famous in British history. Elizabeth I left bizarre instructions for her body after she died. Breaking with the royal tradition of embalming, she insisted that people leave her body intact. Many whispered that this was to guard her secrets, but either way, her ever-loyal ladies-in-waiting made sure to protect her wishes, even after death. After Elizabeth passed, her advisors searched her belongings and found a letter buried deep in them. Its contents were heartbreaking. It was a letter from her old lover, Robert Dudley, who had passed just after the Spanish Armada in 1588. But even more touching than the letter itself was the note Elizabeth had scrawled on it. She marked it as his last letter to her. Since she had no heir, the House of Tudor, which began in 1485 with Henry VII, ended with Elizabeth. Although she kept it on the down low for political reasons, Elizabeth loved her mother, Anne Boleyn, very much. She quietly honored her and her family by taking care of their positions at court, and always kept her mother's portrait in a locket on her necklace. After Queen Elizabeth II, who reigned for 70 years, And Queen Victoria, who reigned for 63, Elizabeth I is the longest reigning British queen. She was in power for 44 years. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe for more videos like this one.